Trump's Iran attack speech summary. Will the regime's enforcers crack? Trump's Iran address could define a generation, depending on what happens inside Iran next. Trump's brief speech announcing the US's major combat operations in Iran accomplished two objectives simultaneously. Trump justified the strikes as self-defense against an imminent threat and presented Iran's leadership as a regime that requires replacement. The timing matters because this incident was not pitched as a one-night raid. Trump described a massive and ongoing operation and warned Americans to expect possible US casualties. He also delivered a blunt message to Iran's security apparatus. Lay down your weapons and you will have complete immunity or face certain death. Then he turned to the Iranian public and told them to stay sheltered until the strikes end, and to take over their government afterward. That combination is the central tension, a military campaign designed to destroy capability now, while trying to create political collapse later. The story turns on whether Iran's coercive machine fractures under pressure. Key points. Trump announced that the US military began major combat operations in Iran, describing the goal as defending Americans by eliminating imminent threats from Iran's regime. He framed Iran as a long-running sponsor of violence against Americans and allies, citing historic attacks and proxy warfare as justification for a new campaign. He reiterated a firm red line: Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, and tied the new operation to earlier strikes he said hit nuclear sites last year. He described an expansive target set: Iran's missiles and missile industry, and Iran's navy, alongside a broader promise to curb Iran-backed armed groups. He warned that US service members could die and asked Americans to pray for troops, explicitly acknowledging the political and strategic risk of casualties. The most consequential line was political. He offered immunity to Iranian security forces who disarm and urged Iranians to seize control once the strikes end, signaling regime change pressure. Iran has spent decades in strategic conflict with the US and key US partners in the region. The modern pattern is familiar. Iran builds leverage through missiles, maritime pressure, and relationships with armed groups. The US tries to contain that power with sanctions, deterrence, and occasional strikes. In Trump's framing, the nuclear question is the non-negotiable boundary. He repeated that Iran must never get a nuclear weapon, and he presented the new attack as the enforcement step after diplomacy failed. He also leaned on a moral argument: Iran's leadership is violent abroad and repressive at home, so military action is not only about security, but also about changing Iran's political future. The pressure, major combat operations with an open-ended end state. Trump did not describe a narrow mission like punish and leave. He used language that implies duration and breadth, massive and ongoing, paired with objectives that go beyond a single capability removal. That matters because broad objectives create broad requirements. If the goal is to meaningfully reduce missile capacity, maritime power, and proxy reach, the campaign can expand fast, especially if Iran disperses assets, adapts tactics, or shifts to retaliation. The conflict, defense language alongside a regime change invitation. Trump called the objective "defend the American people" and described imminent threats. But he also told Iranians that the regime should end with the operation. These two frames have the potential to steer policy differently. A self-defense operation has a clearer stopping point, to degrade the threat and then stop. In a regime fracture strategy, the success is determined by political outcomes that you cannot fully control. The limit: Iran's retaliation capacity versus the casualty threshold. Trump acknowledged the core constraint directly: Americans may die. That admission is important because the first major decision point often comes after retaliation, not after the first strike. If Iran can impose sustained costs through attacks on regional bases, partners, shipping, or cyber disruption, US leaders face a trade-off. They can absorb losses and hold course or escalate to suppress retaliation, which tends to widen the war. The practical limiter is not only military capability, it is tolerance, the level of casualties, economic disruption, and regional instability that domestic politics will accept before demanding either escalation for victory or an exit. The leverage: split the enforcers, shorten the war. The offer of immunity or certain death holds significant weight. It is a mechanism to encourage defections from the forces that keep the regime in power, so that military pressure produces political collapse faster than a long degradation campaign would. If that lever works, Trump's strategy gains an off-ramp. The campaign ends not because every launcher is destroyed, but because the state loses the ability to coerce at scale. If it fails, the campaign's military aims become heavier, slower, and more unpredictable. The signal: who controls the streets and whether defections begin. Because the hinge is political, the clearest early signals are political too. Watch whether security units visibly fragment, whether senior commanders appear unified, and whether protests grow and persist despite repression. Also watch whether the regime can maintain basic control of cash, fuel, communications, and transport, because fear becomes action when people believe the state is losing grip. If Iran's security services stay cohesive, the take over your government line becomes rhetorical rather than operational, and the campaign shifts toward prolonged coercion and deterrence. The consequence: if the hinge fails, escalation becomes the default pathway. A regime that survives initial strikes typically responds with asymmetric pressure, persistent retaliation, calibrated attacks, and efforts to impose costs without offering a clear one-hit we can absorb and stop moment. That dynamic is how mission creep happens. Each retaliatory wave creates pressure for another suppression wave, and each suppression wave expands targets and risks. What most coverage misses: the hinge is not the first night of strikes, it is whether Iran's security forces believe survival is safer than loyalty. That changes the incentive structure inside Iran. If commanders and police believe they could keep their lives and status by stepping aside, the regime's coercive capacity can collapse faster than its hardware. If they believe defection guarantees chaos, revenge, or prosecution, they will tighten ranks, and the war drifts toward a longer contest of endurance. Two signposts would help confirm which way the conflict is going. First, there should be credible evidence of organized defections or refusals to deploy, particularly from units typically responsible for controlling protests. Second, signs that elite protection measures are accelerating: public absence of top figures, unusual internal messaging, or emergency rule changes that suggest fear of internal betrayal. What happens next? In the next 24 to 72 hours, the immediate question is retaliation intensity. Trump has effectively set a deterrence boundary by warning Iran not to challenge US power, but deterrence is tested by action, not language. In the following weeks, the campaign's direction depends on how Iran adapts. If Iran disperses assets and shifts to asymmetric responses, the US faces a choice between widening targets to reduce retaliation capacity or narrowing aims to reduce exposure. Over months, the long-term stake is regional order, because a prolonged US-Iran conflict reorganizes alliances, raises the risk of miscalculation, and forces every neighboring state to pick a posture. The main because mechanism is simple: sustained conflict turns security planning into economic planning, with shipping, energy, insurance, and investment all priced in chronic risk. Decisions and events to watch include any formal US statements that define end conditions, any visible change in Iran's command structure, and any international mediation effort that produces verifiable constraints rather than vague promises. Real-world impact: a shipping firm reroutes vessels away from high-risk lanes, raising delivery times and insurance costs that show up in retail prices weeks later. A US family with a service member in the region watches deployment guidance tighten, while political arguments at home harden around casualties and how long this lasts. A regional business delays hiring and freezes expansion because the risk premium spikes, not from one strike, but from uncertainty about the next. An airline adjusts routes and fuel planning as airspace risk expands, creating longer flights and higher operating costs that ripple to tickets. The next test for power and credibility. Trump's speech set a high standard for success by promising both security outcomes and political transformation. If Iran's internal coercive structure fractures, the operation can be framed as a short, decisive campaign that removed a threat and opened a new chapter. If it holds, the US inherits a harder problem: how to prevent retaliation and nuclear breakout risk without sliding into an open-ended conflict. The signposts are concrete: the scale and pattern of retaliation, the cohesion of Iran's security forces, and whether the US begins describing clear end conditions rather than broad aspirations. History will remember this moment as the point when US policy shifted from containing Iran's reach to testing whether Iran's regime could be shaken by force.